My family didn't come to my graduation. Instead, they sent a text saying that what I was doing wasn't really important. But just 3 weeks later, those same people called me home and asked me to sign a document that could make me lose everything I had tried to build just to save my brother. And in that moment, I realized something I had been avoiding for years, that I was never truly seen as a daughter in this family, but just someone they kept around to use when their own world started to fall apart. The hall was packed that day, filled with the sounds of talking, laughing, and chairs scraping as families stood up to take pictures of their children in a moment everyone had waited years for. And I sat there in the student section, holding my graduation cap, my eyes fixed on the family area where I had memorized the location. Row 4, seats 11, 12, and 13. Those 3 chairs were still empty. No one was running late. No one was rushing in after the ceremony had started. And there was no sign that they were on their way. I took out my phone as my name was about to be called, not out of hope anymore, but just out of habit. The screen lit up with a single message from my mother. It was short, to the point, and it was enough to make everything clear. Jason needs help signing a contract today, so we have to be there. Your degree doesn't really change anything anyway. I read the message once, then again, not because I didn't understand, but because I wanted to be sure I'd read every word correctly. And strangely, I wasn't as shocked as I thought I'd be. There were no tears, no strong reaction, just a quiet emptiness in my head. My name was called. I stood up, adjusted my gown, walked past the rows of seats, and went up on stage to the applause of people who didn't even know me. As I received the diploma, I could still hear the cameras clicking below, parents calling out their children's names, and laughter mixed with a pride that I didn't have in that moment. I didn't look up at the family section again. I just walked down, returned to my seat, opened my phone again, took a screenshot of the message I'd just received, saved it to a folder I'd almost never used before, and then locked the locked screen as if it were just a small task to complete. No one around me noticed anything unusual. I didn't tell anyone either. And it was then that I understood something very simple but very hard to accept. That some wounds don't make a sound, don't draw attention from others, and don't need any witnesses, yet they stay with you longer than anything else. After the ceremony, I didn't go home right away. I went back to my small apartment on the west side of Columbus, a place I was so used to that I no longer noticed the air conditioner had been broken since the beginning of summer, and the only fan had to run all night just to keep the air from becoming suffocating. My apartment had just one small bedroom and a kitchenette big enough for a microwave and an old wooden table that I used as a place to work, eat, and sometimes a place where I'd sit for hours calculating how much longer I could survive if something went wrong. My mornings usually started quite late because I worked the night shift at a grocery store, about a 15-minute drive from my house, where I'd stand behind the cash register or stock shelves until almost midnight. Then I'd come home, open my laptop, and continue with freelance jobs involving Excel, data entry, just for cleaning up spreadsheets for clients I'd never met. There were days I slept less than 4 hours, not because I wanted to work so much, but because I had no other choice if I wanted to keep everything from falling apart. The $45,000 student loan didn't just disappear because I had graduated. It was still there, reminding me every month that I had no room for error. And the rent always seemed due sooner than I expected, especially during weeks when my freelance hours were down or the store cut my shifts. I had gotten used to checking my bank account every night before bed, not to see how much money I had, but to make sure I still had enough to not be late on another payment. Meanwhile, my family was living in a completely different world. Jason had just received an $80,000 investment from my parents for his logistics startup. Every time I called home, I could hear the confidence in his voice as he talked about new contracts, growth numbers, and expansion plans that sounded impressive, but never had any specific details. My father always spoke about Jason as if he had achieved something huge. And whenever the conversation shifted to me, the atmosphere seemed to completely change, becoming colder, shorter, and less patient. I once asked my dad if they could help me with a small amount to ease the pressure during the first few months after graduation. He didn't have to think long before answering. His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear enough for me to understand my exact place in that family. Jason is building a future. You're just dragging out your studies. I didn't argue. I didn't explain that I had been working and studying at the same time. I also didn't mention that the money they gave Jason was many times more than what I had asked for. I just nodded, said I understood, and then ended the call as if it were just a normal conversation. But the difference wasn't just in how they treated us. It was also in how they trusted. They believed Jason even when what he said didn't entirely make sense. They didn't believe me even when everything I did was verifiable. And maybe that's what made me start paying more attention. At first, it was just small details. Numbers Jason mentioned that didn't match what I knew about the market, delivery times he quoted that sounded too perfect to be real, and the times he would evade my questions when I asked for a little more detail about how his system worked. Didn't immediately think there was a problem. I just felt that something wasn't right. So I started doing what I always do when I'm not sure about something. I wrote everything down. I saved the numbers Jason mentioned during our calls. I compared them with public data I could find. I double-checked every small detail that others might overlook, not to prove him wrong, but just to understand what was really happening. And the more I checked, the more I realized something I wasn't ready to name, but it was clear enough that I couldn't ignore it. There was something wrong with Jason's startup, and if that were true, the problem was much bigger than just nice numbers on paper. I didn't realize right away that something was wrong with Jason's business, because at first, everything he said sounded very reasonable, at least to an outsider. It was a growing startup, the user base was increasing rapidly, delivery times were optimized. Everything looked like what you'd expect from a company on the right track. But the problem is, I'm not the kind of person who just listens for the sake of it. My job doesn't allow for that. I'm used to looking at numbers and wondering what's behind them, and it's that habit that made me start noticing details others would easily overlook. Jason often talked about how his system significantly reduced delivery times, how some routes were optimized almost perfectly, and how the rate of delays was near zero, which sounds impressive if you're just listening, but if you've ever worked with real-world operational data, you know the world out there doesn't work that perfectly. No system can keep everything that's stable for that long, especially in logistics, where weather, traffic, people, and hundreds of other small factors are always creating discrepancies. I didn't say that to Jason. I didn't argue either. I just listened, remembered, and paid attention. At once, he said the number of daily active users on his system had nearly doubled in just a few weeks, and the way he told it made everyone in the family feel proud. But to me, that number didn't align with the typical growth rate of a platform that didn't have a large enough foundation yet. I went home that night, opened my laptop, and tried to find public data related to the market he was in. Not because I wanted to prove him wrong, but because I wanted to understand if I was missing something. I wrote down the numbers he'd mentioned in calls, put them into a simple spreadsheet, and compared them with what I could find from open sources. The more I looked, the more I felt like the pieces didn't fit together. A few small deviations could be normal, but when those deviations appeared repeatedly, in the same pattern, with the same type of data, and always in a direction that made the results look better, it was no longer a coincidence. I started to notice how Jason would avoid going into detail when I asked about the system, how he'd changed the subject to easier topics, and how he always circled back to the overall numbers instead of explaining how they were generated. Didn't immediately think there was a serious problem. I just felt that there was a gap between what was being said and what was actually happening. And that gap was something I couldn't ignore. But I also didn't do what many people would do in that situation. I didn't call my parents to say I was suspicious of Jason. I didn't confront him at dinner. I didn't try to prove I was right. I just did one very simple thing. I started saving everything. I saved the numbers. I saved the way he phrased things. I saved the moments when he said those things. I jotted down the points that I felt didn't make sense, not to use them right away, but just to ensure that if I needed to look back later, I wouldn't have to rely on my memory. It wasn't an emotional suspicion. It was a process of observation. I continued my life as usual, going to my night shift, coming home, opening my laptop, doing freelance work, and spending a little extra time each day reviewing what I had recorded. Every time I checked, I'd find another small detail. Each small detail on its own wasn't enough to conclude anything. But when they were placed side by side, they began to form a picture. And that picture didn't look like what Jason was describing to the family. Didn't rush to a conclusion. I didn't rush to act either. Because I had learned one thing from my own job. Reacting too soon often makes you miss what's most important. An impatient person would want to speak up right away. An uncertain person would want to argue right away. But a person who knows what they're doing will wait. Wait long enough for things to reveal themselves. Wait long enough for the data to speak instead of emotion. And as I continued to look at those numbers, I began to realize something I wasn't ready to say out loud, but it was clear enough that I could no longer go back to how things were before. There was something in Jason's startup that wasn't just illogical. It showed signs of being built in a very intentional way. And if that was true, then the issue was no longer about whether he was succeeding or not. It was about what he was building it on. The call came late one afternoon, as I had just finished my shift at the store and was sitting in my car in the parking lot, my hand still on the steering wheel, before I'd even started the engine. And when my mother's flashed on the screen, I already knew it wasn't going to be a simple call. Her voice was calmer than usual, without its familiar coldness, but also without any concern. Just a neutral tone, as if she were announcing something that had already been decided, and she said that the family would be having dinner together, that it had been a long time since I'd been home, and that this time I should be there. Didn't ask any questions. I didn't refuse either. I just said I would be there. That house was still the same as before, spacious, tidy, and always kept in perfect condition, with everything in its proper place, from the large wooden dining set in the center of the room to the chairs arranged neatly around it, and my father was still sitting in his usual spot at the head of the table, as if it were a rule that never changed. Jason was already there before me. He was leaning back in his chair, talking comfortably, his voice full of energy as he spoke about his work, about new opportunities, about how the company was approaching a major breakthrough, and everyone in the room listened to him as if he were the only thing that mattered that evening. No one asked me about my graduation ceremony. No one mentioned the message I had received. No one said that they hadn't been there. It was as if it had never happened. The meal began normally, with stories revolving around Jason. Numbers, plans, words that sounded very impressive, but still lacked the one thing I was always searching for: clarity. I ate slowly, listening, not interrupting. I knew they hadn't gotten to the real reason for this evening yet. And then, finally, my father put down his knife and fork, looked directly at me, and the atmosphere in the room changed palpably. He said that Jason's company was at a critical stage, that everything was progressing well, but needed some short-term support to reach the final goal, and that the family needed to stand together at this time. I said nothing. I just looked at him and waited for him to continue. He pulled a stack of papers from his side, placed it on the table, and slid it toward me, and as soon as I saw the title on the first page, I understood exactly what they wanted. It was a loan guarantee form, $30,000. Jason leaned forward, his voice softer, almost persuasive, as he said that this was just a temporary step, that the money would turn around very quickly, that as soon as a big contract was finalized, this loan would no longer be an issue, and that the only thing he needed was someone with a clean credit history to sign off on it. My mother chimed in, saying that family has to support each other, that times like these are when everyone needs to stand together, and that I shouldn't be thinking so much about my personal affairs when this was about the future of the whole family. No one mentioned that they had refused to help me before. No one mentioned the amount of money they had invested in Jason. No one mentioned how I was getting by on my own. To them, none of that was relevant. My father looked straight at me, his eyes losing their patience, and his voice lowered as he said that this wasn't a request, but something I was expected to do, that I was a part of this family, and it was my responsibility to contribute when needed. I still didn't answer right away. I looked down at the papers, skimming through the terms, not because I didn't understand, but because I wanted to be sure I wasn't missing anything. And every line made the level of risk they were asking me to accept even clearer. Jason started to lose his patience, his voice growing sharper as he asked what more I needed to think about, that it was just a signature, that everything had been calculated, and that I was complicating a simple matter. My mother sighed, her gaze shifting to that familiar look. The kind that makes you feel you're doing something wrong even when you haven't done anything at all. And she said that if I refused to help the family now, then I should ask myself if I still considered this place my home. The air in the room grew heavy. It was no longer a dinner. It was no longer a conversation. It was a choice laid out with clear conditions. You call sign it or walk away. I put the papers down. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. And I didn't say that I knew something was wrong. I just looked at them once more, one by one, as if I was trying to commit this moment to memory precisely. Then I said something very simple. Let me think about it. No one was satisfied with that answer. I could see it on their faces. But this time, I didn't try to make them happy. I stood up, left the dinner table, and walked to the door as if the evening was over. The next morning, I arrived at the office earlier than usual, not because I wanted to work more, but because I needed a quiet space to think clearly before the day began. And like every other day, the office held its familiar rhythm with the white lights, the steady clacking of keyboards, and small conversations taking place in various corners. I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and tried to focus on my usual tasks like checking emails and updating reports. But what had happened the previous night was still there. Not loudly, but clearly enough that I couldn't ignore it. And I knew I needed more information before I could make any decision. About an hour later, my boss, Daniel, called me into the small meeting room at the end of the hall, a place we usually used for quick chats or tasks requiring high concentration. When I walked in, he had already set out a folder on the table, along with a list of companies seeking to partner with us. He said our department needed to review a few startups before we signed any agreements, that a new round of partnerships was being considered, and they wanted to ensure all potential partners met our risk and compliance standards. My job was to examine the operational data, growth models, and the consistency of the figures these companies were providing. It was work I was familiar with, nothing out of the ordinary. I picked up the list, mechanically scanning each name the way I always did when starting a new file, and then I stopped. Jason's company name was in the middle of the list, not at the end, not in some insignificant spot, but right where a startup under serious considerations would be. I didn't react right away. I didn't look up at my boss. I just stared at that line for a few more seconds, long enough to make sure I wasn't misreading it before turning the page, before turning the page as it was just another name on the list. Daniel went on explaining the deadline, the evaluation criteria, and how the report needed to be clear, well-founded, and not based on gut feelings. I nodded along as usual, jotting down the key points without letting any of my thoughts show. When the meeting ended, I took the file back to my desk, set it down, opened my laptop, and looked at the list one more time. This time, it wasn't as an employee doing a task, but as a person standing between two roles I'd never had to confront simultaneously. This wasn't a coincidence. Jason's company was really applying for a partnership with mine. That meant the numbers he had told our family weren't just stories meant to impress, but had been put into an official file, presented as real data, and were now waiting to be validated. It also meant that if I did my job correctly, I would have to evaluate the very things I was already suspicious of, and the result wouldn't just impact an internal report. It could directly affect the future of his company. I sat still for a while, doing nothing. It wasn't because I didn't know what to do, but because I understood the full weight of what was coming. And in that moment, I had two choices. I could look the other way. I could rush through it, do a quick, superficial check, and just approve what was presented without going into detail. Everything would go smoothly. No one would get hurt. There would be no conflict, no immediate consequences. Or I could do the right thing. I could check every single number, cross-reference all the data, question the parts that didn't seem logical, and write a report that reflected exactly what I found, no matter where it led. No one in the office knew about my connection to that company. No one was telling me to lean one way or the other. The choice was entirely up to me, and that's what made it more difficult than any pressure from the outside. I opened Jason's file. I started with the most basic data: number of users, usage frequency, and average delivery time. I didn't rush. I didn't skip a single step. I did it the same way I had handled every other file before. No emotion, no assumptions, just the data and how it connected. But this time, every number I looked at carried a much bigger question, model. It wasn't about whether it was right or not. It was about what I would do with it if it wasn't right. I began to work as I always do. Not a single step was skipped. Not a single detail was rushed, because I knew that in cases like these, the most important thing isn't speed, but precision. Just one wrong assumption at the beginning, and the entire conclusion that follows would be worthless. I opened the data set that Jason's company had sent, starting with the most basic metrics: the number of registered users, the number of daily active users, usage frequency by time frame, and the average delivery times recorded in the system. Everything was presented very neatly, very cleanly, and was very impressive at a glance. But I wasn't just glancing. I broke the data down into parts, cross-referencing it with independent sources I could access, including market data, data from similar platforms, and public reports that companies in the same field had published during the same period. And right from those first steps, discrepancies began to appear. The number of daily active users was higher than the market average, while the company's scale was significantly smaller. It wasn't impossible, but it would usually be accompanied by clear signs of aggressive marketing or a breakthrough product. Yet, here, I couldn't find any evidence that was happening. I moved on to analyzing traffic, not just looking at the total number, but digging into the sources of the traffic, the times of access, and how users interacted with the system. And what made me pause wasn't the large number, but how those numbers were distributed. The traffic was distributed with unusual evenness across every time frame, without the distinct peaks and troughs that real user behavior typically shows. On the surface, this level of stability might be seen as a strength, but with real-world data, it was a warning sign. I continued with user activity, tracking the behavior of each user group over time, and when I placed the charts side by side, a pattern began to emerge. It wasn't a random error, but a structured repetition, where behaviors were distributed in the same way, with the same frequency, at the same level of engagement, repeating over many days without any natural fluctuation. If these were real users, I would see changes. I would see better days, worse days, and unusual reactions to external factors. But here, everything was too similar, too clean, too perfect. I didn't stop there. I went back to the delivery data, checking the time from when an order was created to when it was completed. And once again, the numbers showed a level of stability that is rarely achieved in reality. There were almost no delays, almost no errors. And when I placed this data next to factors like traffic density or the time of day, the lack of correlation between them became obvious. This was not a system operating in the real world. This was a system that had been adjusted to look like it was operating perfectly. I stopped for a moment, not because I was tired, but because I needed to be sure that I wasn't jumping to a conclusion too quickly. I went back to the beginning, rechecking every step, every comparison, every data source I had used, to ensure that everything I was seeing wasn't the result of a flaw in my analysis. But the more I checked, the more the results were the same. The discrepancies didn't disappear. They connected with each other. They reinforced each other. And when all those pieces were placed side by side, the picture became clear enough that I could no longer call it a coincidence. This wasn't a few misentered numbers. This wasn't an error in the data collection process. This was a constructed set of data, a way of operating, a system. I leaned back in my chair, looked at the screen one more time, and the question in my mind was no longer whether there was a problem, but only one single question: what was I going to do about this? Then the answer appeared very clearly, not as an emotional decision, but as a logical conclusion after all the data had been checked. This wasn't a mistake. This is how they operate. I went back to that house at the end of the week, not because I had made a decision, but because I knew they wouldn't stop until they had an answer. And this time, there was no long dinner or roundabout conversation. Everything started faster, more directly, and more clearly than the last time. The dining table was still there. Everyone was still in their familiar seats, but the atmosphere was no longer like a normal evening. It was like a meeting where the outcome had already been decided, and the only thing missing was my signature. Jason started first. He leaned forward, his hands on the table. His voice was still full of confidence, but it was no longer gentle like last time. It carried a clear impatience, as if he couldn't understand why this hadn't been resolved yet. And he said that there wasn't much time left, that this opportunity wouldn't always be there, and that I was slowing down something that should have been finished long ago. He didn't ask me what I thought. He spoke as if I had already agreed. My mother spoke right after. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was heavy. Every word aimed at emotion rather than logic. She said that family isn't a place to calculate gains and losses, that there are times you have to do the right thing for others and not for yourself, and that I was making things more difficult just because I refused to see the problem the way a family member should. My father didn't speak right away. He looked at me for a moment, his gaze the same as last time. Then he spoke in a low, firm voice without needing a long explanation. He just emphasized that this wasn't an open choice, but a responsibility, that he didn't want to have to repeat himself a third time, and that in this family, when needed, everyone must stand on the same side. No one mentioned the risks. No one talked about the possibility of failure. No one questioned what was happening in Jason's company. They only talked about obligation and about what I should do. I didn't answer right away. I didn't react in the way they might have predicted. I placed my hands on the table, kept my voice steady, and asked a very simple question. Did these numbers come from? The question wasn't loud. It wasn't harsh. But it landed in the middle of the dining table like something no one wanted to touch. Jason laughed lightly, a laugh that was more evasive than confident. and he said I didn't need to worry about those details, that everything had been handled, that there was a whole system behind it that I didn't fully understand, and that the only thing I needed to do was trust. I said nothing. I just looked at him and waited for a more specific answer. My mother interjected, saying that I was going too far, that this wasn't an audit, and that me asking such questions only made the atmosphere tense without solving anything. My father put his hand down on the table, a little more forcefully this time, and said he didn't want to turn this into a meaningless debate, that I was derailing the issue, and that the important thing here wasn't the numbers, but whether I was willing to support the family. No one answered my question. No one explained how the data was generated. No one offered a single specific number that I could verify. And it was that very lack of an answer that made everything clearer than any explanation could have. The atmosphere in the room changed. It was no longer simple coercion. It was no longer a financial request. It became a heavy silence, where everyone understood that something was being hidden, but no one wanted to be the first to say it. Jason leaned back in his chair, his gaze no longer as comfortable as before. My mother grew quieter, and my father held his posture, but his expression had changed, no longer as certain as it was at the beginning. Didn't need to say anything more. I didn't need to prove anything right at that moment either. Because sometimes the right question, asked at the right time, can change the entire way people look at a problem, even if no one answers it. And for the first time since I'd walked into that room, I no longer felt like I was the one being cornered. I said nothing more after that question, didn't try to prolong the argument, and didn't wait for them to change their attitude, because I knew the answer I needed wasn't in their words but in the very thing they were trying to avoid, and I just needed one more step to bring everything to light in a way no one could deny. I stood up, went out to my car, got my laptop, and returned to the dining table as if it were just a task to be completed. No rush, no anger, just a very clear focus. And when I set the machine down in front of me, no one in the room said a word, but all of them were watching. I opened the screen, logged in, and brought up the data sheets I had been working on for the past few days. Not to impress, but to put everything in its proper place. Every number, every chart, every line of comparison arranged in a sequence that anyone who was willing to look could understand. I didn't speak quickly. Didn't say much, either. I just pointed to each section, briefly explaining how the numbers were generated, how they were cross-referenced with market data, and why those deviations couldn't be considered normal. And each time I moved to a new section, I paused long enough for them to keep up. Not because I needed them to agree, but because I wanted to make it impossible for them to say they didn't understand. Jason didn't wait until I finished. He cut in, his voice higher, faster, no longer holding that steady confidence from before, and he said that I was misinterpreting the data, that I didn't understand his system, and that all I was doing was looking from the outside without knowing what was really happening on the inside. I didn't react to the way he spoke. I didn't argue. I just moved on to the next section, where the repeating patterns were placed side by side, where the same type of behavior appeared over the same time intervals, with the same structure, enough to show that this wasn't a coincidence, but a design. My mother shook her head, saying that these things were too complicated and unnecessary, that I was turning a simple issue into something bigger just because I didn't want to help, and that the family shouldn't be dragged into analyses like this when all they needed was trust. My father didn't look at the screen. He looked at me as if he were waiting for something different, a simpler answer, a concession. But as I continued my presentation without changing my tone, raising my voice, or showing any sign of wavering, he began to lose his patience in a way he was trying to contain. Jason shifted from refuting to attacking. He said I was always like this, that I loved proving other people wrong, that I had never truly supported him, and that everything I was doing right now wasn't helping but sabotaging. And each of his sentences was aimed at me as a person and no longer had anything to do with the data in front of us. I still didn't react in the way he expected. I closed my laptop, not forcefully, not abruptly, just enough to end the presentation. Then I looked at them again, one by one, and said the words I already knew I would say before I even walked into this room. I can't sign off on this because this company failed its audit. No one said anything right away. There were no immediate objections, no arguments. There was just a long silence where everything that had just been said lay on the table, impossible to erase and impossible to downplay. Jason was no longer looking at me directly. My mother stopped talking about family. My father held his posture, but his eyes had changed. The certainty was gone, replaced by something harder to name. And in that moment, for the first time, I no longer felt like I was trying to fight them. And I was simply standing on the side of the truth. The silence after my statement didn't last too long, but it was long enough to reveal what had been hidden beneath the persuasion and pressure. It was my father who broke it. His voice wasn't loud, but it was heavy, carrying a mix of disappointment and anger that he no longer tried to hide. He asked me if I was fighting against my own family. That question wasn't looking for an answer. It was like a line being drawn in the sand, where any choice I made would place me on a clear side, either with them or against them. And from the way he looked at me, I could see he had already decided what he believed was right. I didn't answer right away. Not because I needed time to think, but because I wanted to be sure that what I said wasn't driven by the emotion of the moment. And I knew very well that if I reacted as they expected, it would just turn into another argument where no one was really listening. I looked at him, kept my voice steady, and said to something I had arrived at after everything I had seen and checked. A sentence that wasn't long or complicated, but was enough to put everything in its proper place. No, I'm not fighting the family. I'm just not going to destroy myself. No one said anything right away. That answer didn't make a sound, but it changed the entire direction of the conversation. Because for the first time, the issue was no longer whether I would help, but what they were asking me to trade away. Jason was the first to react, but this time his voice wasn't as sharp as before. It was more hurried, as if he were trying to keep things from slipping out of his control. He said I was overreacting, that all the risks had been calculated, and that nothing would happen if everything went according to plan. I didn't argue. I didn't need to. Because the very way he spoke told me what I needed to know. My mother looked at me with an expression I'd seen many times before. The look of someone who doesn't understand why things have to be so difficult when, to her, the solution is so simple. She said that sometimes in life, you have to take risks for the people who matter, that no family is perfect and no decision is completely safe. My father said nothing more, but he didn't take back his words. And his silence this time was no longer pressure, but more like an acceptance that I wasn't going to change. I realized something in that moment. Before, every time I faced them, I always felt I needed to explain, to prove, to make them understand. But this time, I no longer felt that need. Didn't need them to agree. I didn't need them to accept it, either. I just needed to make my choice and stand by it. No more words could change that. No pressure worked in the same old way. Because for the first time, I was no longer standing in the position of someone trying to be accepted. I was standing in the position of someone who knew exactly what they were protecting. Things didn't collapse immediately after that evening. There were no calls the next morning, no sudden announcements or major events that changed everything in an instant. And it was that slowness that made what happened later all the more clear, because every step could be traced back to the decisions made before. I went back to my job the next week and completed the report just as I would with any other file, not adding any personal comments, not overemphasizing anything, and not downplaying what I had found. I simply presented the data exactly as it existed and let the conclusions form from the numbers themselves. My report was submitted. The process continued. No one asked me about my connection to that company. No one asked me to change a thing. And the outcome arrived the way it always does in this environment. Through an official decision based on risk assessment and compliance levels. Jason's company was not approved. There were no lengthy explanations, no exceptions. Just a clear conclusion that they didn't meet the necessary standards for a partnership. That wasn't the end. It was just the starting point for what happened next. When a major opportunity is denied, the hidden problems behind it begin to surface in ways no one had noticed before. Smaller partners start asking questions, financial sources become more cautious, and the numbers once presented as proof of growth start to face closer scrutiny from multiple sides. The system can look perfect for a while, but when placed under different perspectives, the inconsistencies are no longer so easy to hide. Jason's startup didn't collapse in a single day. First, it slowed down. Then it was met with suspicion. Then it lost the opportunities it needed to keep operating. And when there wasn't enough cash flow to sustain it, things began to shrink in the way any business does when its foundation isn't solid enough. I wasn't there when it happened. I didn't witness it step by step, but I heard it through calls I wasn't actively a part of. Jason's voice wasn't the same anymore. The certainty was gone, the ease when talking about the future, replaced instead by halting sentences, delayed plans, and explanations that were no longer convincing. My family changed in a similar way. The calls were no longer about whether I would sign or not. They shifted to what had happened and why things didn't go the way they had expected. The money they had invested didn't vanish in an instant, but it didn't come back the way they believed it would, and that was enough to create a void they didn't know how to fill. No one said it was my fault. No one blamed me directly, but I could feel the shift in how they viewed the situation, as if they were trying to find another way to understand what had happened without having to face the real cause. Didn't participate in that process. I didn't re-explain my report, nor did I repeat what I had said at dinner that night, because everything had unfolded the way it was always going to. Not because I wanted it to happen, but because it was the result of what had been built from the start. The calls started coming not long after, not in a sudden rush, but scattered over many days, at different times, as if they were trying to find a more suitable approach, one that might get me to respond in the way they wanted. And every time the phone buzzed with a family member's name, I saw it, but I no longer felt the pressure to answer immediately like before. At first, it was Jason. His voice lacked the confidence I was used to hearing. Instead, there was a restrained urgency in his speech. He explained that things weren't going according to plan, that there were unforeseen factors, that the market had changed, and that if they just had a little more time, things could be different. And between those words was a suggestion, not stated outright, but clear enough to understand, that I could help in some way. I didn't interrupt. Nor did I agree. I just listened until he was finished, then said that I'd heard him, and left it at that. No advice, no analysis, no attempt whatsoever to fix what had already happened. Then it was my mother. Her voice was softer, slower, carrying more emotion than before. She talked about family, about what we used to have, about how people shouldn't let things like this drive them apart, and that sometimes in life, what's important isn't who is right or wrong, but whether we still stand together. I understood what she was trying to say. But I also understood that what had happened wasn't a simple misunderstanding that could be solved by just letting it go. I didn't argue with her. I also didn't bring up what happened during that dinner. I just said that I hoped things would get better, and ended the call gently. My father was the last to call. No beating around the bush. No emotion. He said the situation was tougher than expected, that there were funds that needed to be handled, and that the family couldn't let things go any further without support. And in the way he spoke, I could tell he was still seeing things from the same perspective as before, only now the outcome wasn't what he had hoped for. I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I knew that any explanation from me at this point wouldn't change how he saw the issue. I said that I had made my decision and I was going to stick to it. He didn't say anything more. The call ended. Didn't block their numbers. Nor did I try to create distance in an extreme way. I still answered when needed. I still listened when they spoke, but I no longer explained. I no longer tried to make them understand. And I no longer participated in conversations whose purpose was to pull me back to a place I had already left. Before, I always thought that if I didn't respond, if I said nothing, things would get worse. That silence meant giving up or rejection. So I always tried to keep things going, whether by explaining or arguing. But this time, I realized something different. Not everything needs an answer. Not every word needs a response. And not every relationship is saved by continuing to talk. Sometimes the only way to stop a familiar cycle is to refuse to participate in it. Didn't change them. I didn't try to, either. The only thing that changed was the way I participated. And when that changed, everything around it was forced to change as well, whether they wanted it to or not. I moved into a different apartment a few months later. It wasn't a much bigger or more luxurious place that others might look at and call success, but just a space good enough for me to live without worrying about whether the air conditioner worked or if I had to count every small expense at the end of the month. The new apartment had better morning light, a desk corner separate from the kitchen, and a quietness I never realized I needed until I had it. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like the world around me was no longer something I had to fight against every day. My life didn't change suddenly. There was no great leap. There was no moment where everything became perfect. It was just that, one by one, things became more stable, more manageable, and less dependent on things beyond my control. I still went to work every day. I still checked data, wrote reports, and did the same work I had done before. But the feeling inside was different. There was no more pressure to prove anything to anyone. No more need to explain my choices. And most importantly, no more feeling that my worth depended on how others saw me. I don't think about my family every day, but they are still there as a part of my life that I don't need to erase, nor do I need to return to how things were. We still talk. Sometimes. Not often. Not deep. But enough for us to exist as people who are connected, without any expectation that things would be like they were before. And that, in a way, made everything clearer. I used to think that success was something that had to be seen from the outside. Achieving a position, a number, or a result big enough to make the people who once doubted you change their minds. I used to think that if I did well enough, if I proved myself enough, then one day they would see me differently. But after everything that happened, I realized that way of thinking wasn't getting me where I wanted to go, because it still put me in the position of waiting for validation from other people. And that isn't really freedom. I was sitting in my new apartment on an ordinary evening, with nothing special going on, no one else around, just a quiet space where I could clearly hear my own thoughts, and I articulated something I had never fully understood before. I used to think success was about proving them wrong, but it's not. Success is when I no longer need them to be right. If you've watched this far, I want to ask you a very simple but not so easy question. If you were me in that moment, would you be willing to sign off on a decision that could destroy your future just to save your family? Or would you choose to save yourself? Please write a single word below, sign or don't, because I really want to know what you would choose. And if you've ever experienced the feeling of having to decide your own worth in a situation where no one was on your side, then you'll understand that sometimes the hardest thing isn't losing a relationship, but daring not to betray yourself. And if stories like this make you think more deeply about life and the choices you're facing, then stick around, because the next video will put you in a situation even tougher than this one.